Welcome to the Deck Dive, everybody. Today we're going to be tackling something that sounds like it sounds like an Onion headline, honestly, but I assure you it's very real. We're going deep on the U.S. tax code. It just got a pretty major overhaul, and the inspiration for this new tax code is, well, let's just say it's not your typical policy wonk material.
It's definitely something that makes you raise an eyebrow.
Yeah,
Yeah, this isn't just some,
right.
minor tweak to deductions or something like that. This is like restructuring the whole financial system of the country
Uh,
based on some very old ideas.
Exactly. Our source material today is an article from the outside. It's called New U.S. Tax Code Reflects Biblical Values, Adjusts Deductions Based on Gender. It's by Jaime Hoerricks. And the real kicker here is when they say biblical, they mean like literally biblical. We're talking Leviticus chapter 27, verses 1 through 7, as like the guiding principle for how much your kid is worth. Tax, worth, you know.
You know, Leviticus 27,
Yeah.
in its original context was about vows and offerings to the Lord in ancient Israelite society. And it included valuations of people for redemption, which is very different from how we think about tax policy today, obviously.
Right. And this isn't just some, abstract theological debate or something. This has like real world consequences. This new tax code literally assigns different values to male and female dependents. Like, just to give you an example, a 10-year-old boy gets you a $20,000 deduction, but a girl the same age only gets you $10,000.
Oh, yeah, that brings up some pretty serious questions about whether it's even legal to base a secular nation's tax policy on religious texts, especially when it creates such a clear disparity between genders.
Yeah, and the article actually quotes a few government officials who are not shying away from this biblical justification at all. The Treasury Secretary Caleb J. Usury calls it a long overdue correction to bring U.S. tax policy in line with, quote, Christian principles. And get this, Providence Q. Flagbearer, and yes, that's their actual name, claims that this is going to, quote, encourage families to have more boys, to prepare for, quote, future holy wars against our enemies.
That's pretty alarming rhetoric. This is a very clear example of what's known as Christian nationalism, this movement that seeks to merge biblical law with American governance.
Okay, so it's not just about taxes then. We're talking about reshaping the entirety of American society. Based on one particular interpretation of the Bible,
Right.
the article points out that this could have massive implications, and not just for people's wallets.
Yeah, for sure. I think what's important to understand about Christian nationalism is that they often use a very selective interpretation of the Bible to support their goals. So they focus on certain passages that they think help their case, and they ignore other passages that might contradict their agenda.
Right, right. And it's interesting because Jaime Hoerricks, the author of this article, they don't just analyze this from some kind of like academic distance. They actually lived in a community that was deeply entrenched in Christian nationalism. So they bring a really personal perspective to how this ideology actually plays out in everyday life.
Yeah, it's one thing to read about these concepts in theory, but when you hear about the lived experiences of someone who's actually seen it firsthand, it really adds a whole other layer of understanding.
Absolutely. And one of the things that Hoerricks talks about, one of the most striking points they make, is about the disconnect between the historical Jesus and the version of Jesus that is often championed by the Christian nationalist movement. It's almost like they're talking about two different people.
It's a really good point. The article actually delves into the historical context of Jesus' life, exploring the possibility that he was a member of the Essenes, which was a Jewish sect known for their communal living and their rejection of material wealth.
Which is a really interesting contrast, right? Because that really challenges the common narrative, especially this idea of the prosperity gospel that's so popular among some Christian nationalists, like the idea that if you're faithful, God will bless you with material wealth and success.
Right, exactly.
And Hoerricks even points out that some of Jesus's actions, like the miracle at the wedding at Cana where he turns water into wine, might have had symbolic meanings related to Essene practices that go beyond just a literal interpretation of the story.
Yeah, that story in the context of Essene beliefs could be seen as a symbolic act of transformation and communal restoration,
Yeah.
rather than just a party trick.
Exactly. And Hoerricks actually lists 5 key points where they see Christian nationalism directly contradicting the teachings of Jesus. Things like Jesus' rejection of nationalism, his embrace of the marginalized, his focus on love over domination, all of which clash with the Christian nationalist agenda.
It's a powerful critique. It really forces us to confront the ways in which religious texts can be manipulated to serve political purposes.
For sure. And this brings us to a really fascinating turn in the article. Hoerricks introduces the concept of Gnosticism, which offers like a completely different lens for understanding the teachings of Jesus.
Oh yeah, Gnosticism, with its emphasis on personal enlightenment and inner knowledge as the path to salvation. That stands in really stark contrast to the emphasis on external authority and rigid dogma that we often see in Christian nationalism.
Right. The article even quotes from the Gospel of Thomas, which is one of the Gnostic texts. And in it, Jesus says, "The kingdom is inside you and it is outside you."
That's interesting. It's
Oh,
very
wow.
different from what you typically hear in mainstream Christianity. That quote really highlights the Gnostic belief in the inherent divinity within each individual, a concept that directly challenges the power structures of organized religion.
Yeah, and Hoerricks points out that this challenge to authority is probably a big part of the reason why the Gnostic Gospels were ultimately suppressed by the early church. It's a reminder that history is often told from the perspective of those in power.
Absolutely.
So we've gone from a biblically inspired tax code to exploring the historical Jesus, and even dipped our toes into the world of Gnosticism. It's a lot to unpack, but I think it sets the stage for a really important conversation about the implications of Christian nationalism in America today.
Yeah, I agree. It's a conversation that we need to be having.
For sure. So we've been talking about this idea of Christian nationalism, like how it's shaping policy, how it's related to the historical Jesus, and even how Gnosticism offers this alternative viewpoint. But let's kind of shift gears for a second and talk about what it's actually like to live in a place where this ideology is really dominant.
Yeah, that's where Hoerricks' personal experience becomes so valuable. They describe living in this rural area where Christian nationalism is just deeply embedded in the community.
Right.
It's not just about what people believe, it's about this social pressure to conform and a very specific definition of what it means to belong there.
It's easy to think of this as just like a political or theological debate, right? But the article really brings home the point that this has a real impact on people's lives,
Mm.
on their sense of safety and well-being.
Exactly, and Hoerricks talks about this constant pressure to conform.
Yeah.
These subtle ways in which those who don't fit the mold are made to feel like outsiders.
They mention those seemingly innocent questions like, which church do you go to?
Mm.
Which like assume that everyone is a churchgoer, that faith is a given, not a choice.
Right, right.
Or businesses that very prominently display religious symbols, signaling that your patronage is welcome only if you share their beliefs.
Yeah, it creates this atmosphere where anyone who's different just feels constantly judged, like they're walking on eggshells all the time.
Yeah.
It's a very effective way to silence dissent and enforce conformity.
And then there are the more overt displays, right? Hoerricks describes seeing signs declaring Jesus is Lord over America, or hearing churches preach against the dangers of secularism and things like that. It's a pretty clear message that this ideology sees itself as the rightful ruler of the nation.
That's where it crosses the line, I think. From personal belief into a political ideology that seeks to impose its values on everyone, whether they agree or not.
Right. And for Hoerricks, being trans and non-religious in this kind of environment, it meant constantly feeling like they were under scrutiny, like simply existing was a challenge to the status quo.
And their story highlights the very real fear and isolation that many people experience when they live in a place where their identity or beliefs are seen as a threat.
It's a reminder that the stakes of this debate are high. We're not just talking about abstract ideas. We're talking about the lived experiences of real people who are being marginalized and silenced.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which is why this idea of reclaiming the true message of Jesus, as Hoerricks puts it, becomes so important. They argue that the Jesus championed by Christian nationalism is a distorted version. It's one that bears little resemblance to the historical figure who preached love, compassion, and inclusivity.
Right, it's like they've taken the image of Jesus and molded it into a weapon to be used against anyone who doesn't fit their narrow definition of what it means to be a true American.
And to really drive that point home, Hoerricks draws on their research into the historical context of Jesus' life, suggesting that he may have been part of the Essenes, that Jewish sect known for their communal living and rejection of material wealth.
It's a perspective that challenges the common narrative, particularly that prosperity gospel that's so popular in some Christian nationalist circles. It suggests that Jesus' teachings were more aligned with social justice and communal care than with individual wealth and worldly power.
Right, like those "what would Jesus do"
Yeah.
bracelets, but applied to actual social and economic policies. Hoerricks argues that a lot of what's happening under the banner of Christian nationalism would probably make Jesus turn over a few tables, so to speak.
It's a powerful image that exposes the hypocrisy at the heart of this movement. They claim to be following the teachings of Jesus while simultaneously advocating for policies that directly contradict his message of love and compassion.
Yeah, it's pretty wild. And just to add another layer to this whole discussion, Hoerricks brings in Gnosticism, which, as we touched on earlier, offers a very different way of understanding Jesus and spirituality in general.
Right. Gnosticism, with its emphasis on personal enlightenment and inner knowledge, stands in direct opposition to the idea of blind faith in external authorities.
It's almost like they're saying, don't just take someone's word for it, even if they claim to be speaking for God. Seek truth for yourself.
That message of individual empowerment is pretty radical, especially when you consider the historical context. It's no wonder the Gnostic texts were seen as a threat by those in power.
Right. But going back to the real-world impact of all this, Hoerricks doesn't shy away from sharing their own experiences of living in a community dominated by Christian nationalism. They talk about the feeling of being constantly watched, the subtle threats, the knowledge that any visible display of their true identity could make them a target.
It's a chilling reminder of how easily ideology can be used to create a climate of fear and control. It highlights the importance of speaking out against these kinds of abuses, even when it feels risky to do so.
It's like they're saying, this is what happens when a particular worldview gains too much power. It starts to silence dissent, to marginalize anyone who doesn't conform. And that's a danger to everyone, not just those who are immediately targeted. It's a call to action, a reminder that we can't afford to be complacent when we see these kinds of trends emerging. We have a responsibility to speak out against injustice, to defend the rights of all people, and to ensure that our society remains a place where everyone can live freely and authentically.
I think that's a great place to pause and reflect on what we've covered so far. We've gone from the specifics of a biblically inspired tax code to the broader implications of Christian nationalism. And we've heard a powerful personal story about what it's like to live in a place where this ideology holds sway. But there's more to unpack, and in the final part of our deep dive, we'll explore ways to resist this tide of intolerance and work towards a more just and equitable future. Welcome back for the last part of our deep dive. We've talked about a lot, like that biblically inspired tax code, the whole idea of Christian nationalism, and even what it's like to actually live in a place where those beliefs are all around you. But the article doesn't just leave us with a sense of like doom and gloom, Hoerricks actually ends on a note of hope. They say we're not powerless against these trends. Yeah, what I find inspiring about Hoerricks is they give us real, concrete ways to push back against this Christian nationalism thing, to take back the story and try to build a more inclusive and fair society.
They're really big on knowledge being power. They say that Christian nationalism kind of thrives when people don't know the history, the details of the theology, how these ideas are being twisted for political reasons,
Right, like you're shining a light on something that likes to stay hidden. The more people know what Christian nationalism really is, the less power it has to control them.
And Hoerricks doesn't just say, go learn stuff. They actually give practical advice on how to do that. They talk about looking at things from different points of view, questioning what you think you know, and getting better at critical thinking so you can see through all the propaganda.
It's like building up your defenses against misinformation.
Yeah.
Right? The more you practice critical thinking, the better you get at spotting those warning signs, like the twisted history, bad logic, all those things they use to back up these ideologies.
They even talk about how important it is to have those hard conversations, with your friends and family who might be caught up in all that Christian nationalism stuff. They admit it can be tough, but they say those personal connections and talking things out can really make a difference.
It's about meeting people where they are, actually listening to them, and then gently challenging what they think with facts and kindness. It's not about winning an argument. It's more like planting a seed of doubt, getting them to think critically, and opening up a space for a different kind of conversation.
And Hoerricks makes it clear this isn't just about having intellectual debates. It's about actually doing something, making your voice heard, standing up for what's right.
They talk about voting, supporting groups that fight for equality and justice, making sure our elected officials are responsible for the policies they make and the way they talk.
It's about realizing that what we do as individuals actually matters, that we can change things, even when everything feels so huge and overwhelming.
And they really stress how important it is to be united, to support those who are the most marginalized, the ones Christian nationalism is targeting.
Yeah, it's about realizing that when one group is attacked, we're all attacked. Our freedoms are all tied together, and we have to protect each other.
It's about building bridges, having empathy, and trying to make a world where everyone feels safe, respected, and like they belong.
So where do we go from here? What are some things our listeners can take away from this deep dive?
Well, I think the most important thing is remembering that knowledge is power. The more we know about Christian nationalism, its history, tactics, and why it exists, the better we can fight it.
And that means being willing to have those tough talks, speaking up when we see unfairness, and using our voices to push for a world that's more inclusive and just.
We also have to be careful about where we get our information, get good at critical thinking, and be wary of anyone who's trying to use our fears and beliefs for their own benefit.
It's about realizing this isn't just some political or religious debate. It's a fight for the very soul of our country, for the values we believe in, for the kind of world we want to live in.
And it's a fight we can win, but only if we're willing to get involved, educate ourselves, speak up, and stand together.
That's a powerful message of hope, and I think it's a great place to wrap things up. Thanks to everyone for joining us on the deep dive. Remember, stay informed, get involved, and never stop fighting for a better, fairer world. We'll see you next time.